Welcome back to another episode of CAN TV Conversations. I'm your host, David Korzanowski, and joining me today is Ward Miller of Preservation Chicago. Ward, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely, David. It's a pleasure.
Ward, how about you start off and tell me a little bit about your organization and what you guys do around the city?
So we're a nonprofit organization. We're Preservation Chicago. Our service area is just the city of Chicago, so we don't even go into the suburbs like Evanston, home of Northwestern University. We're, as I said, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the built environment in Chicago, and that includes historic buildings that are architecturally significant or historically significant, or important to the community. So we work with community groups, we work with all stakeholders, city officials. You'll oftentimes see us or hear us testify at Commission on Chicago Landmark meetings, zoning landmarks and building standards committees of the City Council, and also sometimes before the Planning Commission, as well as speaking with the media like yourself, towards issues that are important to either a larger city or our communities.
That's so exciting, and it sounds like great work. We talked about sort of the organization as a whole. I'd like to focus on you a little bit. You mentioned that progression from a part-time worker to now all the calls come into your phone. Can you talk about how long you've been with Preservation Chicago and some of the ways that your role has progressed throughout the years?
Sure. So I was one of the founding board members of Preservation Chicago, actually part of the initial discussions of the organization. And I later became one of its presidents, and former staff and a former president, Jonathan Fine and Michael Moran and Stacy Fingston. We're all volunteers at first, and then Jonathan and Stacy became part-time employees of the organization. And so when I came on board, I was again a part-time staff member, and we were able to grow it over the last 8 years. The organization has been around since 2001, so we're celebrating our 20th anniversary.
So a bit of a broad question, but your organization works to preserve historical landmarks that also mean a lot to the community. What makes your work so important, and what do you think people around Chicago maybe need to know about the architecture in their city that they might walk past without even thinking about it?
So, Chicago has an amazing history, both an American history and architectural history, and community histories that are more local, if you will. We're probably best known for our architectural history on the world scale, as well as our other contributions. But looking at it from the historical and architectural perspective, a source of great tourism is our architecture. And of course, we lost a great number of buildings in the early years of the preservation movement and even prior. But I think one thing that Chicago has done through all of our community organizations working together, but I have to give a shout out to the Chicago Architecture Center, now the Chicago, it's the Chicago Architecture Center, used to be the Chicago Architecture Foundation, and it was originally the Chicago School of Architecture Foundation that started in the 1960s to save the Glessner House and other buildings, and of course, the loss of the Garrick Schiller building by Adler and Sullivan, and later the Chicago Stock Exchange by Adler and Sullivan really brought preservation to the forefront. But it also brought education of these buildings and why they're so important to the forefront, because prior to these demolitions and prior to the establishment of all these organizations, including ours much later, of course, Chicago's architectural relevance was known by architectural historians and scholars and architects themselves, right, but really wasn't known to the general public.
You mentioned that the education process with communities specifically. How have communities that you've worked with sort of received your organization and worked with you guys? And how has sort of that education process been to spread the word of the beauty of so many buildings around the city?
So we have a lot of community engagement. A lot of times the communities reach out to us. We when we were founded, we were saving buildings in the Loop, downtown Chicago, buildings of great note that maybe hadn't been recognized in the same way they could have been in the 50s and 60s, but buildings that were definitely part of the downtown streetscape, if you will, like the New York Life building, which is now the Hotel Gray, and buildings like the old main Chicago post office that was thought to be just too large and would have to be mostly demolished in its center, as it extends over the expressway, and orange and red rated buildings. Those are buildings deemed by the city in a published 1996 survey that went back to the 1980s, early 1980s, that color-coded buildings, red being the most significant and probably recognized on the world stage, and orange-rated buildings that are mostly important to the local city of Chicago and communities. And from that survey, a lot of things sprung. But we have communities that reach out to us regularly to save buildings. We also outreach to communities of disinvestment, including public housing projects like Altgeld Gardens and Lathrop Homes, both which have an incredible history, both architecturally and historically. Altgeld Gardens is where a guy named Barack Obama got his start in community engagement. We thought it was important to save those buildings and public buildings that are part of that development. One of our perhaps most recent ideas is the landmark designation of the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley House in Chicago, on Chicago's South Side, in the West Woodlawn neighborhood. And this is a building that was home to the Emmett Till and his family, and it was a 2-flat turned into a 3-flat. The lower level became a basement apartment. I should say the basement became a garden apartment, if you will, and it was filled with, Emmett and Mamie's relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins. And it must have been just a really wonderful building to be a part of as a kid. And then, of course, Emmett took this fateful journey, this nightmare journey down to Mississippi to visit relatives, and the nightmare began, if you will, of his lynching that so impacted people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and people like Rosa Parks, and really was sort of a big spark, if you will, in the civil rights movement. And we thought it important to save this building that was not protected in any way. It was not even orange or red rated in the city's CHRS, the Chicago Historic Resources Survey, and realizing the building had become vacant or was near vacant, with 2 or 3 parcels that were vacant to its immediate north. We saw this and falling into disrepair. We found this to be a priority, and we pushed very hard in the media and with our community engagement. Worked with Naomi Davis and BIG, Blacks in Green, to make this a reality with media and help from the broader community of Woodlawn and West Woodlawn and Hyde Park, and the Hyde Park Historical Society, and Alderwoman Jeanette Taylor, and the Till family. On the 65th anniversary of Emmett Till's death, the week before the Landmarks Commission hearing, we got the approval to landmark this building from all points. And on the actual day of the Landmarks Commission meeting was the 65th anniversary, the beginning of Emmett Till's visitation and funeral. And we thought that to be so significant, especially in these times, of George Floyd and, racial injustice being brought to the surface and protests throughout the United States. This was all happening. And one commissioner, Commissioner Hughes, mentioned at the Landmark Commission hearing that this was a monumental moment for this commission and also for the city. And, if not but for us, we don't know what uncertainty in what future that building would have had, but there's discussion of it and plans of it that have been published of it being a national site and a museum.
Fascinating story. You mentioned saving buildings, that phrase. What goes into that? How do you save a building that's vulnerable or in danger of being demolished?
Well, each building is sort of customized in its advocacy and preservation efforts, and some are much easier than others. And telling that story and reaching a broad audience, but we oftentimes tailor each individual building to a specific plan, and the plans are usually thought out carefully by us. A lot of discussion around a plan of action to save a building, and working with elected officials, aldermen, the city's landmark staff. If the building is landmark worthy, if it fits the criteria. Otherwise, sometimes it's just working with the developer directly to save a resource, and oftentimes they come to us and ask, hey, how can I do this? And can you assist us? Let's all get together and figure a path towards a reuse and preservation effort. And that's where we come in.
The last question I have for you is about the 7 most endangered buildings in Chicago. So you publish this list every year. Could you talk about the list of 7 in 2021? You don't have to go through all 7, but maybe a couple and why they stand out, and maybe some of your plans to help preserve.
So our number 1 entry is the Chicago lakefront. And people are kind of curious about that. But you don't have to look far to find out why that was our first nomination. And it ties into the Chicago park system and a lot of buildings in severe deterioration. A number of them in Jackson Park alone have trees growing out of their roofs or are collapsing, so much so that they have to be fenced off. This is the Daniel Burnham designed comfort station on South Shore Drive near 67th Street, which is a near collapse and was then just recently hit by a car, which further damaged it. And, there's no plan to repair this, which is just insane to me and to us. So insane to me personally and disappointing to us as an organization. The Iowa building, so-called Iowa building rebuilt in the 1930s, is a beautiful, stone building at 56 and Lakeshore Drive, has holes in the roof and trees growing out of it. There's a comfort station or what was a public bathroom made of field stone right behind the Museum of Science and Industry, one of our biggest attractions, which doesn't even have a roof on it anymore. And the walls are tarped in blue plastic wrap. Just almost unheard of, right? And that's just the beginning. There are paths and walkways and underpasses that are in need of reconstruction. We have brownfield sites, the former U.S. Steel site on the lakefront in South Chicago, as well as the Jean Point du Sable Park at the mouth of the Chicago River, that are brownfields that should be turned into safe green fields in public parks. And wouldn't this be amazing to have the U.S. Steel site turned into green space and continue that lakefront public access and to make it more than just a thin strip, which is Steelworkers Park, but to really engage a lot of green land and green space over there, which is still, fenced off and perhaps toxic. Let's protect the Chicago lakefront. Let's bring in the idea of making it a national park and help with the lift so that we have the national park system, the city of Chicago and the Chicago Park District helping with the lift. And maybe we can keep these parks in better shape, and maybe we can encourage better security in these parks with park rangers that can help families, and also help with this National Park Service turn those brownfield sites into green parks and maintain these buildings with the national park system, which would also bring huge amounts of tourism to Chicago, as the national parks are great features and places that people want to visit. That's our number one. Also, our Roman Catholic churches of Chicago. There are 88 of them that are closing or consolidating. 25 of them are currently for sale. We're very concerned about these buildings being cornerstones of our communities. But beyond the faith aspect, think of the fact that they offer social services, childcare, food pantries, so many things. And we feel that if a lot of these were landmarked and protected, that it would encourage the Archdiocese to rethink their approach. And oftentimes when these institutions leave a neighborhood of investment, disinvestment, it's the last resource in the community, and hope is greatly diminished oftentimes, and those services are diminished. Also the Phyllis Wheatley House, which is on Chicago's South Side, and this is a really fabulous building built in the 1890s, but by the 1920s became home to African-American women immigrating from the South, the rural South, to Chicago for better opportunities. And they were often denied access to the YWCA or the Eleanor clubs or the places where other women could stay in another age. And escaping the Jim Crow South, if they didn't have relatives, family or friends that they could stay with, they oftentimes ended up homeless. And so this really was an amazing organization. And there were several of these sort of settlement houses for African-American women. But this one is the last remaining Phyllis Wheatley House. Anyway, those are just a few of our Chicago 7 most endangered buildings and sites in Chicago. And it's really meant to bring a focus and a spotlight attention to these resources that are endangered. And we not only point out the history and how they should be treated, their significance, possible landmark designation oftentimes, but we also offer suggestions and ideas as to how they could be repurposed, how they could be reused, how there's a path, if you will, towards a reuse and a rethinking of these structures. And oftentimes we've had a lot of success towards preservation of these highlighted buildings. Not all the time, but a lot of times. Right. And even if you're not on our list this year and you were on previously, you are still part of our Chicago 7 most endangered list until the building is either, restored, landmarked, repurposed, or in some cases demolished.
Well, that sounds awesome. The lakefront idea has me excited. I'll go to bat for you on that one any day. So
thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Ward Miller from Preservation Chicago, fighting for and preserving some of the most iconic buildings in the city. Ward, thanks so much for your time today.
Absolutely, Dave. It was a pleasure. Pleasure to be with you.